Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sociology 111. Today, we're going to continue talking about relationships, and specifically, we're going to continue this idea that we talked about in the last lecture about power in relationships, specifically power from sociology, and how that applies to relationships in a marriage and family class. So, over here, I have some of the definitions we've been working with. And in sociology, we think of power as the ability to define relationships and create the rules, whether hidden or overt, of society. So, as we've talked about and Foucault brought up in our discussion last week, this idea of being able to not only define a relationship, but to actually make people buy into these definitions is itself a tremendous power. So, we think we talked about things like social media influencers, social media influencer, in the media in general, even just stars or celebrities. Seeing these sorts of depictions of goals, values, morals. This ends up shaping how we relate with each other. And as we mentioned then, those who have influence on the rules have tremendous power in society and who we become, right? And because we're talking about relationships, this also influences then how our relationships are defined. And again, I have marked here whether hidden or overt rules. So we talked about two different types. The overt ones, which are like laws and policies, while the second one is more like norms, like whether you are perceived in a good way or a bad way in society. So where we left off then at the end of all this is the problem of agency, which we've been talking about. So how can we actually challenge power? So Foucault was really good at showing us the pervasiveness of control in our society. We talked about panopticon, and in a lot of ways we're responsible for our own control and our own adherence to the system itself. So that idea of things are watching us and things see us makes us panopticon. Makes us do what we're supposed to do. So we no longer need direct punishment. But we have indirect control. Because we don't know when we're actually being watched, and we tend to control ourselves. Okay, so today we're going to try to take a look at actual strategies to relook at our relationships and try to take some of this power back. So two things we're going to recall. We're going to draw a lot of these stick figures today. So if you recall the very early classes, so this was me, and this is my baggage that I bring with me, our quote baggage. The suitcase, so this is maybe things like my gender identity, my age, me being a teacher, things like that. And whenever I relate with somebody else, this could be an other. In this case, let's say a partner. You talk about what they also bring with them: gender, age, their own history and culture. And so there's one part here, what I bring to the table. There's a second part here, what they bring to the table. And there's something entirely new here in the middle. A new sort of thing, it's the relationship itself. And this is the part we're interested in sociology. This is the mysterious, third part that is created beyond the control of two other people. So we have to recall this. This is something we're going to be thinking about. This dynamic bond between people. And then we really then are trying to explore the second part, the power of those people who have the ability to define this relationship. So I may define being a partner, and my partner may define that in a certain way, but society may have a different view on what a partnership is. And we always have to contend with that based on what we're bringing with us. Okay? So let's go to the second stage there. So how do we address this? So again, Foucault argued that we're controlled, largely controlled by ourselves and the perception of others. So the big question is then, what do we do about it? That's our big question mark for today. So Todd May, he's a philosopher, actually not a sociologist, but a philosopher that is really was concerned about this. So he's really concerned with our ability to change society and how we could do so in a world that's controlled by the media. We take a look at some images of Todd May. He's just a philosopher. I think he's working at a UCLA. He writes a lot about things like death and dying, and he's also a consultant for philosophy in general. So his background isn't so important as it is he's trying to look in modern society like Foucault was and saying, given a modern society that is made up of social media and all these influences, how do we not only take control of our own lives, but he's also really interested in changing society itself. So the big questions, he's not interested in just having a good life, but how do we have a good society? Okay. Good life and good society. So, like some of the other folks we've talked about earlier, he believes that context is everything. So there's no set self nor relationships. We are made up by the social, political, and economic context. So very much like Buber and Zaldua and Foucault we've talked about, we are dependent on those around us. So he's essentially, he wouldn't say this exactly, but he's essentially talking about the I-thou relationship. That this relationship that we have in society is something that's fundamental not only for ourselves, so our own life, but also the social life. Okay? So part of this question then, in looking at the world and how to change society, again, he's asking the question, why do people do what they do? And really, why do systems of inequality continue in society? So the big question, like if we look around, in spite of all the social movements that we've had, the effort and time put into overcoming racism and sexism and ableism in society, why do they still exist? It's a big question mark. Why do they still exist? So often in sociology and often people thinking about change will think about things in a big way. So macro, written very big. So they're thinking about big systems. So they're thinking about large systems. They're looking at the big picture. Maybe this is supposed to be a globe. A globe. They're looking at the whole world. Macro, looking at large systems. Well, May is a little bit more interested in micro. So I'm writing this small thing. So a little bit more interested then in what we do, maybe between people or between a few people, but kind of what we do on the small level, small scale. We'll go into more detail on this, but May is arguing that much of what we can do about society is going to be down here. We can't necessarily change this all at once, the macro all at once, but if we understand what's going on here at the individual level, maybe we can move this direction. So maybe if we figure out what's going on at the small scale, maybe if we figure out what racism, sexism, ableism look like on the small scale and our micro interactions, maybe then we can start figuring out what we could do about it at the bigger level. Okay? So because this interaction is so important, because the individual interactions matter so much of who we are, he thinks that this is probably the area where we have the most potential. You can highlight this little part that's kind of covered up. The most potential for change is the interaction itself. Okay? So looking at the small picture. So part of his unsettling conclusion, like Foucault worries about, is because we're looking at the interaction. So because we're looking at this into micro level, because we're at this scale, the small scale, this means we have a larger role, will play a larger part in oppressive systems that maybe we're comfortable with. It doesn't mean that we make our own oppression, But he believes that this individual level that's often ignored is the site of where a lot of this stuff happens. And as a secondary thing, he also thinks that we at this small individual level, we largely can't affect the big things like we think we can. He doesn't think we can necessarily go in and affect the big macro level of things, the big world. We can't go in and change systems directly, but we do that incrementally. We do that a little bit every day, interactions we have every single day. Because he would actually argue that that big macro system like a school, for instance, the school itself is abstract, it's not real. The school, he would argue, is made up of a bunch of little interactions. It's made up of a bunch of the micro. So for instance, how a principal interacts with a teacher, how a teacher interacts with a student, or how a teacher interacts with a parent, different things like that. So it's made up of dozens of these micros. So you can think of micros as dots all around that all together end up making up the macro. So over time, if you're able to change enough of these micro interactions, you could start changing the shape of the big macro level thing. Because how do we actually go about changing the school itself? The school itself is not really a real thing. It's only as real as all the little pieces that make it up. So he thinks that we gotta change the interaction. So focus on every day, key point, that make up the bigger system. Rather than focus on the macro, focus on the micro. Okay? So what does this actually look like? So we talked enough about the abstraction. What does this actually look like? So he basically has a careful strategy, and he applies this to actually changing systems of inequality, but we could apply it to relationships. So the basic idea is take careful account of your relationship and all the intersections. So think of all the things that are going on in your space, social, political, and economic context, to best determine how to counteract or undermine problematic portions of the relationship. So let's go back to our school example that we were just talking about. Should bring this last one up. So if we're back here, and we're actually going to think about the student-teacher relationship. So if we're actually thinking about the student-teacher relationship, you would actually want to go through and see all the different things that are going on in this interaction. You want to look at all the different things that are happening between these two people. So you might come up with things like, let's just pull it back here so we have more space. Teacher, student. And you think of all the different contexts that a teacher-student has. So for instance, a teacher is paid, it's a job. A student is forced to be here. A teacher might be underpaid though, they might be tired. Student may also be struggling to get to school. Maybe doesn't have adequate supplies. The teacher has power in this situation. That's one of the things you could think about. So you think about all these different contexts. So if you were analyzing this relationship, you would think about all these different things that are in there. Maybe even the gender and race of the student and teacher, level of ability, age. Age is a factor between these two, class. All these different things you could think about with a student-teacher relationship. And these become easier to list if you're thinking of someone specifically. Like specifically, if I were talking about myself as a teacher, I could list my degree, I could list where I work. But the idea being you look at all these different things and you think about how they interact with each other. So if I'm thinking of specifically as a teacher at PVC and specifically as a student at PVC, you can start actually thinking about the larger structure of PVC based on these different things, on these interactions. So for instance, I think in a teacher relationship, I think age can often play a factor, especially if you're talking about K through 12, where the teacher's going to be older than the student. There's definitely power going to be here, and depending on the race may be something that plays a role, degree, things like that. So you start seeing all these intersections here, and then you can start strategizing what that means. So in my ability to articulate then why age is something in here, maybe I'll focus on that. I can start saying that in U.S. society, age is a factor. Often, especially if we're thinking about youth or kids are less valuable than adults. We tend not to believe what children say are more valuable. So if you are thinking of like, what's the problem going on here between students and teachers in this society, maybe this is something you could come up with. So you might say, well, maybe in our school, maybe in our society, we'll have to come up with ways to better deal with age, right? So essentially what May's arguing then is to come up with a kind of a power map of individual relationships in a context, and just trying to track power, weaknesses, and strategize to try to make the world a better place. So essentially then, we would just want to take a look at our own relationships, whether there's a problem or not, and try to identify factors that are in them, so perhaps we can make them better, right? So this could also not only be done interpersonally, it could be done with spouses, partners, parents, siblings, and friends. It could even be done in relationships that are not as personal, more abstract, like a worker-boss relationship, to try to get an idea of what's going on in that relationship and what things are happening, to strategize. Okay? So we're going to move on and do this yourself. So drawing a relationship power map. So this idea then is kind of taking exactly what May had done and applying it to your own life. So start thinking about these intersections of power, because we're going to go into more of them in the upcoming classes. Just the different things we've talked about in your own experiences. And take a look at some of the early assignments and drawings we've done in relationships. So for instance, you could take a look at one you did of yourself and a partner, or any one that you've done throughout the term, or start a new drawing. And think about all different ways to relate with each other, all the different things that we would do, and the baggage that we bring with us. And start to identify where the powers lie. So kind of going back to even just drawing our stick figures and thinking about what different things each relationship is bringing and how that changes the dynamic in the middle. So you could focus on yourself or the other, and the other could be anybody you relate with. It could be friends, family, it could be any sort of relationship. Or if you're uncomfortable looking at that specifically, it could just be a general relationship. But it's a little bit easier if you're thinking of someone specifically. So you versus the other, what sorts of things are you bringing in? And for instance, I had always talked about, my occupation, so as a teacher, or my degree, different things like that, my interests. And the other, in this case, I could think of my spouse. One of the main things that might come up between both of us would be race, so race and gender. So I am a cisgendered white male, and my partner is a Vietnamese American female. So race and gender might be something really important to take a look at here as far as power goes. So how do these dynamics result in power? What inequalities might happen? So for instance, in U.S. society, along race and gender, we might think of, my opinion being more valuable generally, right? So we both have advanced degrees, but when we're in social context, there is occasions where my opinion is more valued than her opinion, simply because of, or largely because of a race and gender valuation in our society. So by identifying a specific situation, we can start seeing these inequalities. And we already did one for teacher-student. This could be the other example. A teacher-student. If I were doing this for myself, I might identify then that there's a differential in power there. If we're not careful, having the difference in power may result in inequality. So largely do this and start thinking about this. This doesn't have to be perfect. The main idea is us just to be wanting to get the ideas of power and how that intersects with our relationships. So in the discussion, this idea of discussing the strategy with your peers. So what potential problems of power did you identify, whether they're with you or with the other person you're analyzing? And even just start thinking of some ways you might address them. And they could be very simple as waiting for the other person to talk more, being more patient with them, or they could be larger things like pay gaps in society, things like that. Also, think about May's idea of power. So do you agree with this or not? Does this make any sense to you? Can we be mostly summarized in this way? Is it enough just to look at a relationship to determine how systems may work? So can I look at my relationship and talk about society? If you think so, then why is this? Why do you think this works? If not, what's missing? What's missing here? Let's go start taking a look at this, and we'll start building on this idea along towards the end of the term.